this is Dana and welcome to my channel, The Orchid Hut. Today's video is going to be about Phalaenopsis orchids. You know, there's sort of a typical yearly life cycle that we expect Phalaenopsis orchids to go through. But sometimes there are exceptions to that expected pattern of growth. And oftentimes it causes orchid growers to be concerned about whether their orchid is behaving correctly. You know, is there maybe something wrong with it? So the first thing that we're going to do in this video is talk through the typical, normal, expected pattern of what the Phalaenopsis orchid does over the course of a year. And then we will talk about some of the other situations which are also normal and not anything at all to be concerned about. So let's start with a life cycle diagram. There's an arrow here for each of the 4 seasons. We're going to start at the top of the cycle in the fall season or the autumn. And you know, it doesn't really matter what month that season happens for you. And of course, you know, there's differences between the northern and southern hemispheres anyway. But the fall season actually begins not so much when the calendar says it does, but for your area, when do you notice the number of daylight hours decreasing? When do you notice the temperatures cooling down a bit? And you know, for me, where I grow my orchids in Southeast Texas, we have an extended growing season, and fall typically does not start in September like it might for people in other locations. Fall for me starts more in late October. So whenever fall starts for you, this is where we're going to begin in this life cycle model. And for Phalaenopsis orchids, this is typically the season when we expect spiking to begin developing. So if an orchid is going to set a new spike, and if it is triggered by those cooler temperatures, that's if, then you will see some Phalaenopsis orchids begin to set their spikes during the fall season. Now, of course, this can extend into the winter as well as into the early spring, but fall would be the earliest that you might see that happening. Now, as we move into the winter months, what you would typically expect to see is that new Phalaenopsis spike continuing to develop, likely starting to bloom. And then as you move into spring, the spike will oftentimes begin to start to decline later on in the spring. And as soon as that spike is removed, the plant is then encouraged in the later spring and into the summer to begin vegetative growth in the way of new leaves and root development. And then, of course, into the summer, that vegetative growth and root growth continues until you work yourself back around to the fall season again when the orchid is ready to have another bloom spike. So that's the typical yearly pattern of a Phalaenopsis orchid. You know, the other thing to remember is that a Phalaenopsis orchid will typically drop a leaf or two from the bottom of the axis, probably at about the same time that the spike is dying back or soon after the spike is cut. And then the new growth begins after that leaf has dropped. So, you know, we're going to look at a couple of Phalaenopsis orchids today that are behaving differently, but yet they are perfectly fine, normal, nothing to be concerned about. So the title of this video says, you know, can a Phalaenopsis multitask? Meaning, can it do some of those things simultaneously or maybe at unexpected times of the year? And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. So let's have a look first at this one. So this Phalaenopsis orchid is dropping a leaf right now. Perfectly okay. You know, this leaf will eventually dry enough that it will naturally separate from the bottom of the plant, and when it does, it will just fall away. There is no new leaf growth right at the moment. However, if you look at the root tips, you can notice that the root tips are growing, they're active. There are some new root tips happening right there and right here. You can also see some new root development inside the pot right there, as well as right there. So this orchid is growing new roots. It's dropping a leaf, and then of course you can also notice that it's developing a spike right now. So, you know, the care for this orchid is to continue to give it weak fertilizer because it's developing this spike and it's developing new roots. And this is perfectly okay. It's a bit out of sync because this is the beginning of spring where I live. And this leaf drop is maybe a little bit out of the ordinary, but is perfectly okay. All right, let's look at another one. This one is similar. It is dropping a leaf soon. It is, believe it or not, just beginning to spike right down here. This is a late spiking orchid, and it will be a summer bloomer. And then, of course, all of these new root tips are active and growing. It's difficult to see what's happening inside this pot, but you can see a couple of roots sticking out right here that are actively growing. And so this orchid is pretty much doing all of the steps with the exception of developing new leaves right at the moment. Okay, and one final example. This particular orchid is developing a new leaf. It does have new root growth, and it is also developing a new spike all at the same time. So this orchid is not dropping any leaves. It had actually done that a few months ago, but it's multitasking. It's doing a couple of different phases of growth all at the same time. So you will often read that orchids have to follow a certain pattern of growth, and while that is often typically true, it's not always true, and it does not mean that there's anything wrong with your orchid. It just means that it's behaving a bit differently, and I always say orchids will do what they want to do when they want to do it, and Phalaenopsis orchids are no exception. So if you learned something new or enjoyed watching this video, please give it a thumbs up. The subscribe button will be coming up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Thanks so much for watching, and talk to you next time.